So we have two ways of modeling ternary relationships into the relational structure. The first way is if we have already converted the relationship into associative entity. Okay, because we learned while we were discussing associative entities that if the degree of relationship is greater than 3 or greater, then that relationship is converted into associative entity. Or if we have a binary or unary degree relationship and the cardinality is many to many, that is also converted into an associative entity. So the first way is if we have already converted the relationship into associative entity during the conceptual modeling, then that associative entity would be converted into a new relation, and all of the participating entity types, they'll also be converted into relations. So overall, we'll have 4 relations. If the degree is 3, we'll have 4 relations. One for each basic core entity and one for the associative entity. And because there is always a one-to-many cardinality relationship, whenever an associative entity is created, there is always a one-to-many cardinality relationship between the participating entities and the newly created associative entity. So what is the rule? Whenever there is a one-to-many cardinality, and now because all of these newly created relationships, because they are binary degree relationships, so what is the rule on conversion of binary degree relationships with the cardinality of one to many? What is the rule? The primary key of one side goes as foreign key to the many side. So same rule applies over here. Okay, if the relationship is already converted into associative entity, now we have 3 new relationships. Okay, let's just try to understand this thing with the help of an example. So for example, there is a ternary relationship. Okay, for example, this relationship is between a part and a supplier and a warehouse, for example. If during conceptual modeling, if we converted this relationship into an associative entity, 3 new relationships have been created, and the cardinality of all these 3 relationships would be one to many. So as per rule, now we shall be having 4 different relations, right? One relation for all of the participating entities, one for each, and one relation for this associative entity. So this associative entity shall have 3 foreign keys. Okay, all of the participating entities' primary key that would be shifted or that would be created as foreign key in the associative entity, and those 3 foreign keys, they'll reference the primary keys of these participating entities. Okay, so this is if we have already converted. Okay, if we have not, then again we'll have 4 relations. Okay, one for each participating entity and one for the relationship or for the associative entity. Okay, so overall, if we have a degree of 3 or higher, the number of relations in the relational model would be equal to number of participating entity types plus 1. And similarly, for example, if we have a 4 degree relationship, a relationship with 4 participating entity types, we'll simply have 5 relations when converting that conceptual design into the logical structure. Okay, so one relation for all of the per the participating entity type, and the 5th relation for the relationship, and that 5th relation shall be having foreign keys from all of the participating entity types. Okay, because there is a one to many cardinality binary relationship. जी, सारी एंटिटीज के अंदर उनकी अपनी प्राइमरी कीज होंगी, वो वहां पे आके फॉरेन की बन जाएगी. नाउ अगेन वी हैव टू ऑप्शंस. एक ये है कि अगर उनकी रेपिटिशन का खदशा है, ठीक है, अब मिसाल के तौर पे इसी मिसाल को लेके चलते हैं. हमारे पास एक पार्ट का रिलेशन बन गया, ठीक है, with for example part id as primary key and part name for example and some other attributes, title for example, and we have another relation which is a supplier's relation. For example, supplier id is the primary key and for example name is another attribute, and we have for example warehouse as the third relation. Warehouse id is the primary key for example, and title is another attribute. Now for associative entity, we shall be having a fourth relation, and this relation shall have foreign keys from all of three participating relations. So part id as a foreign key, supplier id as a foreign key, and warehouse id as a foreign key. So all these three foreign keys, they'll reference to their respective primary keys. Okay, now this part id is referencing to this part id, this supplier id is referencing to this supplier id, and this warehouse id is referencing to this warehouse id. Now we have two options. The first option is if there is a chance of repetition of these groups of values. For example, there is a part with part id 1, and this part has been supplied by a supplier whose id is 1 for example, and this has been supplied from the warehouse 1. Okay, so 1 is something, 1 is something, and 1 is something. Okay, now if there is a chance of repetition of these values, for example, as per the scenario, there is a chance, let's assume there is a chance that for example this has been done on a date and on another date same combination can be repeated. In that particular case, we cannot use these foreign keys as a composite primary key for this newly created relation. Rather, we shall have to add a new id to be used as a primary key for this newly created relation. Okay, and the second option is if there is no chance of repetition of these values, for example, there is no possibility, there is no scenario that these values are repeated, rather the group of these values is repeated, then yes, we can use this combination as a composite primary key. Okay, अगर हो रही है तो फिर अगर रिपीट हो रही है तो फिर हम ऐड करेंगे एक नई प्राइमरी की इसके अंदर, और अगर नहीं हो रही तो हम इसके कॉम्बिनेशन को यूज कर सकते हैं एज कॉम्पोजिट प्राइमरी की. ठीक है, ये एक एग्जांपल है. ठीक है, सो दिस इज एन एग्जांपल ऑफ अ टर्नरी डिग्री रिलेशन. ठीक है, रिलेशनशिप, सॉरी, फिजिशियन है, पेशेंट है, ट्रीटमेंट है, तो हमने उसको एसोसिएटिव एंटिटी बना दिया है, और ये है बेसिकली. बल्कि यहां पे एक और काम हुआ है, यहां पे इन्होंने कुछ इसके अपने एट्रीब्यूट्स को, एसोसिएटिव एंटिटी के कुछ अपने एट्रीब्यूट्स को भी उस कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ फॉरेन की के साथ मिला के एक कंपोजिट की बना दी है. ये भी हम कर सकते हैं, बट रिक्वायरमेंट इज द सेम कि इसकी रेपिटेशन का खदशा नहीं है, तब हम ये काम कर सकते हैं. अगर हमें खदशा है कि ये वैल्यूज रिपीट होंगी कभी भी, तो हम ये काम नहीं कर सकते. अच्छा, एक और नया कॉन्सेप्ट हम यहां पे सुन रहे हैं जो हम यूज करते हैं, या नाम हमें नहीं पता, वो नाम है जी सरोगेट की. सरोगेट की का यही कॉन्सेप्ट है कि आपके पास अगर इस तरह की कॉम्पोजिट प्राइमरी की है जो इतनी लंबी चौड़ी है, and management of such keys is a challenge. Okay, whenever you have a composite primary key including more than one columns, then to manage that type of keys is a challenge. Why? Because this relation can further participate in a relationship. If this relation further participates in another relationship और हमें इसकी प्राइमरी की वहां पे लेके जानी पड़ी तो ये तो अजाब बन जाएगा. To have a 5-column foreign key in that newly created relation, if a new relationship is there, for example. So instead of using such composite primary keys, our recommendation is to just to add a simple single column new identity and use that as a primary key. Okay, so DBMSs provide you with such features of having keys with self-assumed values. For example, you can add a column. For example, if you are working in SQL Server, you can add a column to the relation and you can set the type of that relation as an identity. That would be a numeric value, but whenever a new row is added, the value is automatically incremented. Okay, so इसी तरह से हमारे पास एक्सेस के अंदर ऑटो नंबर की टाइप होती है. If we want to declare that as an entity, if we want to use that as an entity, so that is known as a surrogate key. Whenever a simple new column is added to a relation with the purpose of using that as a primary key instead of using a composite primary key from that particular relation, then that is referred to as a surrogate key. Okay,